Before the first human ever entered space, Earth had already sent many forms of life upward. The first were not astronauts. They were not monkeys either. They were fruit flies. They were placed inside a V-2 rocket captured from Nazi Germany and flown beyond the atmosphere. Later came monkeys, dogs, mice, cats, tortoises, spiders, fish, tardigrades, and even jellyfish and squid. At first, this history sounds like a strange list of animals, but what it really records is how, before humans entered the universe, we confirmed one question, step by step. After life leaves Earth, can it continue to exist? As of around April 2026, if we use the internationally common FAI Kármán line standard, meaning an altitude of more than 100 kilometers, about 650 humans have entered space. Then what about animals? Apart from humans, how many animals have entered space? The answer is difficult to count precisely. If we only count named animals like Laika, ham, and Félicette, the number may be only a few dozen. But if we include fruit flies, jellyfish, nematodes, mice, fish, and insects, the number is no longer in the hundreds. It is at least in the hundreds of thousands. Most of them had no names, no photographs, no monuments. They left behind only a species, a number, an experiment code, and one launch record after another. Today, we are going to tell the story of these animal astronauts. A brief history of animal astronauts, from supersonic fruit flies to weightless jellyfish.
To be or not to be, that is the question.
Before humans officially entered space, the first problem they faced was not an engineering problem. It was a question of life. Whether a rocket could fly high enough was one thing. Whether life could survive once it got there was another. In the 1940s, human understanding of the space environment was still very limited. High-altitude radiation, low pressure, extreme temperatures, acceleration, weightlessness. These words sound familiar today, but at the time they were not science terms for the public. They were unknown risks. No one knew whether cells would be damaged by radiation after leaving the atmosphere. No one knew whether heartbeat and breathing could continue. No one knew whether blood circulation would remain stable. No one even knew whether a living creature, after being launched by a rocket, could come back in one piece. So before humans became astronauts, the first living passengers sent upward were not people. They were fruit flies. On February 20th, 1947, the United States launched a V-2 rocket from White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. This rocket came from a very specific historical background. It had originally been a ballistic missile built by Nazi Germany during World War II. After the war, it was captured by the United States and converted into a high-altitude experimental platform. Inside the payload compartment of this V-2 rocket was a group of fruit flies. It sounds strange. Why fruit flies? Because fruit flies are small, reproduce quickly, and have genetic traits that are easy to observe. They had already been widely used in biological experiments. If high-altitude radiation caused visible damage, scientists could study it through their bodies and their offspring. This flight reached an altitude of about 109 kilometers, above what is commonly considered the boundary of space today. A few minutes later, the payload returned to the ground and the fruit flies were successfully recovered. They had no names, no helmets, and they would never appear on a propaganda poster. But they completed a key mission. They proved that life could briefly enter space without being immediately killed by high-altitude radiation. This was the first step in the history of animals entering space. It was meant to confirm whether life could endure the edge of space. After the fruit flies, humans quickly turned to animals that were closer to themselves: monkeys. A monkey's body structure, nervous system, and physiological responses are much closer to those of humans than of fruit flies. They could provide more direct data. How would the heart rate change? Would breathing become abnormal? Could acceleration cause unconsciousness? Could the body survive the impact of return? In June 1948, the United States launched a rhesus monkey aboard a V-2 rocket. It was named Albert I. That name later became a series: Albert I, Albert II, Albert III, and Albert IV. Albert I's flight was not successful. It did not truly enter space, and it did not survive.
In June 1949, Albert II was launched on another V-2 rocket. This time, it truly crossed the boundary of space. It became the first primate to enter space. The flight proved that a primate could survive the ascent phase. Unfortunately, during the return phase, the parachute system failed. The payload capsule crashed into the ground at high speed. Albert II died from the impact of landing. The later Albert missions repeated this same pattern. Again and again, they were launched on rockets. Again and again, they tested new capsules, sensors, and recovery systems. Some died in flight failures. Some died because of parachute failure. Some experiments ended before they even truly reached space. Seen from today, these experiments were cruel, but at the time, they also revealed a fact. If animals could not return safely, humans could not sit inside a rocket. At the same time, the Soviet Union began to follow a different path. In the early years, the United States used monkeys more often. The Soviet Union chose dogs. The reason was practical. Dogs were easier to train than monkeys. They could stay calm for longer periods. They were also better suited to being placed inside small cabins. Many of the dogs selected by the Soviet Union had originally been stray dogs from the streets of Moscow. Researchers believed they were already used to cold, hunger, and noise, and could better endure extreme conditions. In July 1951, the Soviet Union launched 2 small dogs aboard an R-1V rocket. Their names were Dezik and Zagan. This flight marked an important turning point. They reached an altitude of about 110 kilometers, experienced a short period of weightlessness, and then descended with the return capsule. In the end, both dogs came back alive. They became the first higher mammals in human history to survive a suborbital spaceflight. This meant that the basic loop of human spaceflight had finally taken shape. Life could be sent to the edge of space, it could endure brief weightlessness, and it could return to Earth alive. Unfortunately, not long after, Dezik flew again. This time, it did not come back. Because of a failure in the recovery system, Dezik and another dog died in the accident. By this point, humans knew that life could briefly enter space, but suborbital flight was only a brief touch of the edge of space. The next test was whether life could enter Earth orbit. In 1957, the first animal to truly enter orbit appeared. Her name was Laika.
In 1957, animal space experiments entered their second stage. Before this, animals had only flown briefly to the edge of space, touched it, and fallen back to Earth. But orbital flight was completely different. Once a spacecraft entered Earth orbit, it would circle the planet. That meant longer flight times, a more complex environment, and a much harder return. On November 3, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2. This time, the passenger was still a small dog. Her name was Laika. Laika also came from the streets of Moscow. Later, she went from being a stray dog to becoming the first animal to enter Earth orbit. In the propaganda, she was a space hero. But in the design of the mission, she never had a way home. Sputnik 2 had no recovery system. Laika was never meant to return to Earth. Early Soviet officials claimed that she had survived in orbit for several days, but later released information showed that Laika most likely died within hours of launch because of overheating and stress.
Laika's flight proved a key fact. A complex mammal could withstand the vibration, noise, acceleration, and high g-forces of a rocket launch and continue to maintain basic vital signs after entering orbit. But it also made animal space experiments more than a technical issue. From this moment on, every success began to carry a cost that could not be ignored. After Laika, both the United States and the Soviet Union continued to push animal spaceflight experiments forward. The United States still focused mainly on primates. In May 1959, the United States launched 2 monkeys aboard a Jupiter AM-18 rocket. Their names were Abel and Baker. Abel was a rhesus monkey. Baker was a squirrel monkey. This was not an orbital flight. It was a suborbital flight. But it was still important. Abel and Baker endured high acceleration, experienced about 9 minutes of weightlessness, and successfully returned to Earth. This was the first time the United States brought monkeys back alive from a spaceflight. Baker went on to live for many years. She became one of the few animals in American space experiments to develop a public image. Abel's fate was different. Although she returned safely, she died a few days later during a surgical procedure. This also showed another reality of early animal space experiments. The end of the flight was not the end of the experiment. Many animals, even after returning alive, still had to undergo long-term examination and further study. In August 1960, the Soviet Union completed another key mission. Sputnik 5 was launched into space. This time, there were 2 dogs inside the capsule, Belka and Strelka. Unlike Laika's mission, this one had a recovery system. Belka and Strelka entered orbit, circled Earth, and then returned safely to the ground. They became the first animals to enter Earth orbit and come back alive. Laika proved that animals could enter orbit. Belka and Strelka proved that animals could return from orbit. It is worth adding that Belka and Strelka were not the only passengers on this flight. The spacecraft also carried mice, flies, plants, and other biological samples. It was more like a small life system experiment, used to observe how different forms of life reacted to orbital flight and return. After coming back to Earth, Belka and Strelka became stars of the Soviet space program. Strelka later had puppies. One of them was given to the family of U.S. President John F. Kennedy. At one of the most tense moments of the Cold War, the descendant of a space dog became a very unusual gift between the United States and the Soviet Union.
But before true human spaceflight could arrive, the United States still had another problem to solve. After entering space, a human would not only need to stay alive, they would also need to react, judge, and perform tasks. So, the United States chose a chimpanzee. On January 31st, 1961, the chimpanzee, Ham, launched aboard a Mercury Redstone rocket. Ham had been trained. When he saw a signal, he had to pull a lever. If he did it correctly, he received a food reward. If he did it incorrectly, he received a mild electric shock. It sounds simple, but at the time, this was a critical question. If weightlessness, acceleration, and fear prevented the brain from working normally, then even a living astronaut might not be able to control the spacecraft. Ham's flight was not perfect. The rocket flew higher and faster than planned. The flight lasted longer than expected. During return, the capsule also took on water, creating a dangerous situation inside. Fortunately, Ham survived. And during the flight, he still completed his task. His reaction time was only slightly slower than it had been during training on the ground. This proved a key fact. The brain could still work in the environment of spaceflight. Ham's success directly strengthened confidence in America's Mercury program. A few months later, Alan Shepard completed the first American human suborbital spaceflight. Laika proved that life could enter orbit.
Belka and Strelka proved that life could return from orbit. Ham proved that life could still perform tasks in space. After these experiments, in April 1961, Yuri Gagarin entered space. Humanity had officially arrived. But animals did not leave the history of space flight. From the next stage onward, the question they had to answer was no longer just whether life could survive. In 1963, that question was given to a cat, Félicette. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin entered space. The age of human spaceflight officially began. From that moment on, the role of animals in space began to change. In the first two stages, they had mainly served as test pilots for humans. They tested whether life could withstand launch, enter orbit, and return alive. But once humans entered space themselves, the question changed. The focus of research shifted toward life itself. How would the space environment affect the brain, behavior, development, and reproduction? In October 1963, France launched a Veronik AG-1 rocket. This time, the animal entering space was a cat. Her name was Félicette. Félicette remains the only cat known to have entered space and returned alive. Like Laika and Ham, she was fitted with physiological monitoring equipment. Scientists hoped to use her to observe how a mammal's brain reacted during flight. This was a suborbital flight. Félicette experienced a brief period of weightlessness, then returned to the ground alive. But her ending was not easy. After the mission, she was euthanized so researchers could further study her brain and nervous system. Félicette's story is often mentioned separately because cats are rare in the history of animals in space. She did not become a Cold War propaganda symbol like Laika. She did not directly serve human spaceflight like Ham. She was closer to the beginning of the third stage. Animals were now being used to study how the space environment affects life systems themselves. A few years later, animal space experiments went even farther. In September 1968, the Soviet Union launched Zond 5. This mission carried 2 tortoises, along with fruit flies, plant seeds, and other biological samples. Their destination was no longer just near Earth orbit. It was the region around the Moon. Zond 5 flew around the Moon and then returned to Earth. The 2 tortoises inside the capsule also survived. They had no names, but they accomplished something very important. Before humans flew to the Moon, they carried Earth life around the Moon first. Their survival confirmed that complex life could withstand deep space radiation, weightlessness, and the return process during a circumlunar flight. Not long after this mission, the human moon landing entered its final countdown. In 1973, the American Skylab 3 mission carried 2 spiders into space. Their names were Anita and Arabella. The experiment was simple. Let spiders spin webs in a weightless environment. On Earth, spiders rely on gravity, body position, and spatial judgment when building webs. But in space, gravity almost disappears. At first, the webs they spun were messy. The structure was unstable and the shape was irregular. But after a few days, they began to adapt. The spiders adjusted the way they spun their webs and produced webs closer to a normal structure. This experiment showed that animal behavior is not just a mechanical repetition of instinct. Even in a completely unfamiliar environment, life may adapt and rebuild order. This was also the core change of the third stage. Space animals were no longer just passively enduring flight. They began to show how life reacts, learns, and adapts in the space environment. In 1991, the American Space Shuttle Columbia carried out the STS-40 mission. This time, the animals sent into space were moon jellyfish. Scientists sent thousands of jellyfish larvae into space. In the weightless environment, they continued to develop, and their numbers increased to tens of thousands. Jellyfish may look simple, but they have a very important structure: gravity-sensing organs. On Earth, jellyfish use gravity to tell up from down. This allowed scientists to observe one question: If life develops in an environment with no clear direction of gravity, can it still judge direction normally after returning to Earth? The result was interesting. The jellyfish that developed in space showed abnormal orientation after returning to Earth. Their response to gravity was less stable than that of jellyfish born on Earth. This showed that gravity is not just a background condition. It helps shape early sensory systems in living organisms. For humans, this question is very important. If humans one day live in space for long periods, or are even born and raised in space, could the lack of gravity affect the brain, balance, and physical development? The jellyfish experiment offered an early warning. Space is not simply another place. It can change the way life grows. In 1994, Japanese Medaka fish were sent aboard the space shuttle Columbia. This experiment studied another question: reproduction. In space, can vertebrates mate? Can they lay eggs? Can fertilized eggs develop normally? Japanese Medaka gave an answer. They mated and laid eggs in space, and the fish eggs continued to develop. This became an important milestone in space life science. In 2007, the European Space Agency's Photon M3 mission sent tardigrades into space. This experiment exposed tardigrades to vacuum and strong radiation. Tardigrades are very small animals, known as water bears. They are already famous for their extreme tolerance. They can endure drying, low temperatures, high pressure, and lack of oxygen. But the space environment is even more extreme. There is no air. Temperatures change violently, and radiation is intense. The experiment showed that some tardigrades survived after exposure. More importantly, after returning to Earth, they were still able to reproduce. This made tardigrades one of the most unusual characters in the history of animals in space. In 2021, the SpaceX CRS-22 mission sent Hawaiian bobtail squid to the International Space Station. The focus of this study was not flight. It was not radiation either. It was symbiosis. The Hawaiian bobtail squid carries a special type of glowing bacteria inside its body. The relationship between this animal and its microbes makes it useful for studying immune systems and symbiotic systems. Scientists wanted to know whether microgravity would change the relationship between an animal and the microbes living inside it. This is important for long-term human life in space, because the human body does not exist alone. Our gut, skin, and immune system are all connected to large numbers of microbes. If humans are going to live for long periods on space stations, lunar bases, or even Martian bases, we need to know how microgravity affects these invisible life systems. By this point, animal space experiments had become completely different from the V2 rocket era. The focus of the third stage was to study how life acts, develops, reproduces, adapts, and maintains its own life systems after leaving Earth.
From fruit flies to monkeys, from dogs to cats, from tortoises to spiders, jellyfish, fish, tardigrades, and squids, the history of animal astronauts did not end after humans entered space. It simply changed direction. At first, they helped humans confirm whether life could leave Earth. Later, they helped humans prove whether humans themselves could enter space. And today, they are still answering a more distant question. If life truly has to leave Earth for a long time, can it still develop, reproduce, adapt, and continue? Most of these animals had no names. They left behind only species, numbers, experiment codes, and one launch record after another. No matter how complex or even how cruel these experiments may seem today, they remain an inseparable part of the space age. Humanity should thank these animal astronauts and thank them for taking the first step into the unknown on behalf of life on Earth. This is a brief history of animal astronauts, from supersonic fruit flies to 5,000 weightless jellyfish.
This is BHE, Brief History of Everything.